shots and to kind of show how the background of where they take place can get pushed to the foreground. So a movie like The Road, it does make sense that the road is still there because nothing grows. Because if plants could grow, the road as the highway that he's walking along, it would no longer be there. And you can just look at Detroit. There's urban prairies in Detroit because you get a couple of seeds and they get in the crack in the pavement, and before you know it, it's going to be disappointment. And so kind of using that very literal-minded, almost gotcha approach, I think I can give you some access into thinking about what happens after this version of our civilization fails, and how can we kind of come to terms with fixing those failures. The one, and I started thinking about this most clearly when I was watching The Postman, which I think it's a bum rap. I don't know if it's supposed to be funny, but I quite enjoyed it. And there's actually, in the background of a lot of shots, just windmills. And they actually have electricity because it's running on wind power. And so it's just this little bit of set design, set dressing, that opens up parts of the film that I think are much more interesting than actually just narrative.
Well, I think infrastructure as a topic, I think it sounds to me like you've hit on a good overall topic because I think infrastructure is such an interesting concept and things that think of, the whole idea of looking at infrastructure. And we all are used to now hearing about infrastructure mostly for the negative reasons, but so I could see where this could be an interesting way to continue on with your film study.
Yeah, I think the reason we only hear about infrastructure in a negative sense is because the only time you actually register it is when it fails. And the point of infrastructure, and a lot of people writing about infrastructural studies write this, the point is that it's invisible and that you just take it for granted. And so after the earthquakes in Christchurch, we didn't have plumbing for 6 months. And the city solution, which that was actually kind of awesome, they just put portaloos at the bottom of your driveway. And so I would get up in the morning and you'd just see people walking down the end of their driveway to use the portaloo. And then when we actually got indoor plumbing back in the house, it was so exciting. And so I think it's when you combine that kind of sensibility with kind of generic forms, and usually film studies people find generic forms interesting. There are these moments that escape convention. I think those two put in combination can be really quite fascinating.
Well, good luck with that. It sounds interesting all by itself, even on top of what you've already done. So hopefully if the book when you get it to a point where it's published, which who knows when that'll be, obviously, the research phase is always the most interesting, but also the most tricky part of any kind of project like this.
I mean, I just have a pile of notes now, and eventually I'll actually think of something to say about them.
Right. So hopefully maybe someday we can talk about that. But other than that, I really appreciate the amount of time you gave me today. I mean, I think the book is fascinating to me because it just happens to be things that interest me as well. And many of the films you choose because of the time period you chose, they were right in my period of real understanding. So I hope people reach out for the book, Imaginary Geography of Hollywood Cinema 1960 to 2000 by Christian B. Long. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
What does that do there? You cunt. You fucking arsehole. You fucking cunt. Hope you can read my lips, cunt. Driving your little fucking naughty mobile.
continue to preclude certain British subjects from coming into Australia. They were concerned about maintaining that legal power to exclude non-white, specifically Chinese immigration.
Never like Australia policy.
Well, I think it's important. They should really have it to keep out the coloured races. I think it's a little bit late for that. I think we should take the Asian women. Because the coloured races, when they get into a white country, then they want to intermarry, and I don't think it's fair on the children.
What's that
I
policy?
think it's very cool.
Same, I wouldn't like to see the place overrun by all the...
Fear and whether legally or visually conceived, yes, especially the Chinese, yes, fostered a particularly Australian sense of nationhood. In a way, our whole history, which starts exactly as you've just described, is about defining ourselves by who we are not rather than who we are. So we've defined ourselves through the concept of alienage rather than defining ourselves through a holistic sense of who we are as a nation. And I think that has been fundamental, that legal foundation and the lack of capacity to address that in our Constitution to this very day provides that continuing illness that persists in influencing the public discussion about questions of membership. Each of the changes, significant changes along the way with the Citizenship Act, have arguably been through an interest around immigration policy and who we allow in and out of the country. But of course, citizenship is not just about regulating immigration. Citizenship is also about, well, birth in Australia. But in 1984, the Citizenship Act was amended to say that birth in Australia is no longer enough to become an Australian citizen. You need a parent who is a permanent resident or an Australian citizen to automatically become an Australian citizen by birth. So it really seems that the murkiness of the way that laws were created at the turn of the century at Federation still has a very far-reaching consequences for the way that we understand ourselves, not just legally, but culturally as Australians today. Absolutely. And in fact, if you even think through a move to a republic, we're saying we want an Australian citizen as a head of state. But there's no legally protected concept of Australian citizen in the Constitution. And part of that is because of those very origins that you're talking about. So it does and has had a far-reaching effect on legal concepts, but on broader public understandings of membership in Australia. Kim, where do Indigenous Australians fit into this whole conundrum of citizenship? The Indigenous Australians fit into this story in a way that clearly shows the disjuncture between legal status and rights. Indigenous Australians are, of course, born in Australia. So by being born in Australia, from the time of the colonial experiment, they were British subjects by virtue of being born in British territory. And the reason why people are confused is because even though they were citizens, they didn't necessarily have the rights that we associate with citizenship. Like the right to vote, for example. Like the right to vote. They didn't get the right to vote in the Commonwealth until 1962. So that even though they were citizens, it's a reminder that citizenship doesn't necessarily lead to an equality of rights. And so, in the same sense, you could say here that those natural-born members of this family were full members as British subjects and would have become Australian citizens on the 26th of January 1949. But it was certainly constitutionally possible for the Commonwealth to legislate to treat them differently, even though they were Australian citizens. So George Orwell might have said that not all citizens are created equally. That's right, and Australia is actually a very unfortunate example of that being the case. There is not a clear sense in our Constitution to protect against that discriminatory practice. Kim, as a legal scholar, what do you see when you look at this photograph? I'm looking at this as a sixth-generation Australian Jewish woman rather than as a legal scholar. So there's no adult man, and that's one of the first things that I see. I see that very formal framework of those traditional family shots, but it doesn't really tell me anything other than an attempt to be like the norm of the time, of sitting in a photo in a way that would have been a traditional photo, I imagine, at that time. And do you think that attempt to fit into the image of the Edwardian family is part of the necessity to not look alien. Putting that into the context of knowledge of the time, I think that there was no question that they knew that they would continue to be seen as other despite their legal status. And so that does make sense to think that they were trying to show the community that in every other respect they were like the mainstream British subjects. And do you have Chinese names yourself?
I do. Mine is Yuk Yip, which is Jade Leaf. And I have a twin sister, and she is Golden Branch, because she was 5 minutes earlier than me.
And how do you say Golden Branch in Chinese?
Oh, I forgot.
Remember that you can see the photograph from today's episode on the Shooting the Past website at ABC Online. My thanks to guests Christina Law and Julie Crawford, Dr. Sophie Couchman, and Professor Kim Rubenstein. Shout out to the hospitable staff and management at the Tea House in Chinatown. Thanks also to the Shooting the Past production team. In the next episode of Shooting the Past, a fishy-looking photograph throws me into the deep end of the battle between industry and sustainability. Here, host of the Pineapple Project, the podcast that teaches you the stuff you never learned in school.
I don't know where you have your career crisis, but I am a busy woman, so I have mine in the shower.
This season, we're finding our dream career, building a network and beating burnout at work.
Well, you have 1,440 minutes in the day, just like everyone else.
Siri, so judgy. So make life sweeter and less prickly with the Pineapple Project. Available on the ABC Listen app. Hello, welcome to This Working Life. I'm Lisa Leong. Today we're focusing on job interviews, the good, the bad and the illegal.
In one interview for a waitressing job, the employer asked me what my star sign was, and I said Pisces, not knowing that was an illegal question. And he responded by saying he wanted to hire only Gemini.
When I was maybe 15 years old, and I shook the guy's hand, and he said, "Never shake a hand like that again, it's too soft." And then proceeded to grab my hand quite firmly and say, "This is how you shake a hand." And I was like quite taken back by the whole experience.
So I had an interview for a job that I really, really wanted. It was at the start of my career. I was quite young. I hadn't been out of college for very long at all, just a couple of years. And it was going really, really well. And then the interviewer said, "So you're a young woman. Are you going to be having children soon?" I was well aware of the law, and I said, "You're not allowed to ask me that." But of course I wanted the job, so I said, "For the record, I'm not." But then I felt really bad about having gone along with the question and having given him an answer, because he really had no legal right to ask me that question in the first place.
Oh wow, those are shockers. Well, given that we're not just doing a job for life anymore and that we will have to do more than one job interview, today we're going to figure out how to avoid the bad.
This Thursday, in that Saltmark breakup, they talk about this.
Podcast from ABC.
3,200 desexing of animals. That's an expensive practice.
That's also including the figures from our hospital. The Lord Smith Animal Hospital is the largest veterinary hospital in the Southern Hemisphere, and clients do pay for those services. Those services are dramatically reduced compared to other veterinary hospitals, but we also receive funding from the public. The public give us amazing donations, and we get the bequest as well, but we don't get any government assistance.
Animal hospitals, emergency centres are incredible. I had to take our Snoop the dog down to an emergency hospital because all of a sudden, well anyway, there wasn't anything wrong with him, but and it cost me a little bit. But it was delightful to be able to go somewhere in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock in the morning, and people were really helpful and honestly caring.
Yeah, that's right. And Lord Smith's open till midnight at this stage, and we may be looking at opening longer, but at this stage we're only open till midnight.
Okay, you're into the Geelong one.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the Werribee one. No, Werribee one.
Werribee's great.
Lovely people. Thank you to all the people that do a wonderful job.
They do, yeah.
We're going to take some calls, and I'll come back and ask you some questions a bit more about what you do.
Great.
Dave, good morning.
We actually lost a cat for about 3.5 years here in Brisbane not too long ago. When he did go missing, we suspect he was stolen from an open house being called up one day. He was a little fluff, probably won't know more than a Telio paper. And when the RSPCA actually rang us up 3.5 years afterwards, we'd completely got into microchips. And yep, sure enough, it was our cat. We showed up at the pounds that afternoon, and the guy was so big, he was over 10 kilos. He just actually fit in the cat cage.
So he's obviously well fed.
This thing's a monster. The first night back home, he actually attacked another cat after getting up from his first nap at the house. And the following day, he simultaneously attacked 2 tomcats.
So 3.5 years later.
3.5 years, yeah. He actually ended up on Spencer Housen's show at 612 ATC when he found out about it. And we didn't realise that Spencer's wife was actually one of the producers of Channel 9 News, so he ended up on 9 News as well.
Jeez, that's incredible. It just goes to show how long, well, number one, the importance of chipping, I guess, Serena.
That's exactly right, and also having those details up to date. That's the key there.
Because we lost Snoop the dog when he was only a 8-week-old puppy.
Oh.
And he ended up at the Werribee Hospital again. But that was, thank goodness for the microchipping.
Yeah, absolutely. And I myself have had the same thing happen to me. One of my beautiful cats went missing, and 18 months later I got him back. I got a call from a vet clinic. They had him there, and they rang me, and yeah, there were lots of tears and lots of joy to get him back.
You obviously take it if you're going to rehome pets. What are the reasons that people will bring them into you?
Most of the time, because we're attached to the hospital, most of the time people say they can't afford surgery or they don't have time for the animal. They're probably the main 2 top reasons. Other reasons that are given but not necessarily believed are people saying, oh, the landlord found out about it and we can't keep them. That's actually illegal for the landlord to evict them. I think a lot of people use that excuse to take the pressure off themselves for surrendering the animal, so they don't feel as guilty. But certainly, provided the animal is something that we can work with, and even if we need a little bit of help to work with it, we'll definitely take the animal and we'll try and rehome it and do the best we can.
Serena, it must be very sad for people who have a loved pet, a family pet, and it does need to get some surgery, or it has an illness that is going to need to be in animal hospital for a certain period of time, but they can't afford to pay the bill. Are there ways that they can sort that out?
Absolutely. We offer payment plans. Provided they put down a small deposit, they can actually have a payment plan, and if they're on Centrelink, we take that as well. So there are certainly ways people can pay those bills and have quite a fair amount of time to pay them. It's just whether or not they suit people at that time to do that.
Yeah, and especially for pensioners who may have had pets that are really close to them.
That's right. And you know, we will do everything we can to assist them, but sometimes people decide that they just can't afford it.
Do you get a little bit cranky with the fact that people don't recognise pets as more than a puppy or kitten stage?
Absolutely, but at the end of the day, it's all about the animal's welfare first. So if we think the animal's welfare is compromised, then we'll absolutely take that animal, because it's about the animal, not about the person.
We'll take some more calls. Loretta, good morning.
We got our dog from our local animal shelter, and he is the most gorgeous natured dog that you'd find on the planet. He's just fitted in with the other dogs that we have beautifully. It's like he knows that he's had a second chance, and we really appreciate it. And we've also saved 2 horses from being turned into dog meat because they were just, unwanted, expendable. So.
Yeah, what sort of dog was it, Loretta? Or is it?
He's a red cattle bull Arab cross.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's a big dog.
He's a fairly big dog. He's actually quite chunky at the moment.
Oh, you fed him up too much as well.
He tends to do that himself. When he walks, he looks more like a caterpillar.
Thank you. A couple of points there, Serena. Firstly, when it comes to rehousing dogs, what are the things that you make sure with temperament? And how can you be sure the animal has a good temperament to go to a home?
We do a series of temperament tests. We don't usually do it on the day the dog arrives because the dog's usually highly agitated and it's going into an unknown environment. So we let them settle down for about 3 days minimum, and then we conduct a series of tests. It involves about 3 staff members and at least 1 other dog, and it's a test that was devised for us by a dog training company called Underdog, and we actually have a couple of qualified dog trainers on staff as well, which is very handy. And we run the test. There's a few components to it. One is you actually have to scare the dog from behind and test its reaction, withdraw affection, you remove its food, you let it meet another dog and then see what the interaction's like. So the whole series of tests usually takes about 15 minutes, and then we repeat them several times and see how that dog's going to be. We also, because we can't really test the dogs with children, so we have toy dolls that we have around the dog as well, and then they crawl on the floor and see what the dog's reaction is going to be. Sometimes if we get a bad reaction, we then know we have to work with that dog, and sometimes we send them off. If it's a really bad reaction and we think the dog has a future, we actually send them off to boot camp training, which can be very intense. We had a Mastiff cross Staffy called Hugo. We had him for 112 days before he found a home for him, and he actually went to an 18-day training course just because he was getting a bit agitated being in the shelter system. So he went off for 18 days, came back a new dog, and he got rehomed, which is fantastic.
How on earth would you do that with a cat? Because their cats are up themselves anyway. That's
a bit harsh.
How would you know if a cat's got a good attitude anyway? Because they just look at you like they don't particularly care anyhow.
We can't do temp testing with cats. It's pretty impossible. Cats have a completely different facade when they're in that environment. They internalise the stress, and you're not seeing the true picture. So a lot of the times cats sort of go out to foster care with one of our experienced foster carers. Most of them are staff, so they know what they're doing. And they go out into staff's homes and they spend at least a couple of weeks, and we get a real idea what that animal's like. Because in these shelters, it's impossible to tell. They're usually scared. They're not their true selves.
You never know what a cat's like at any time, no matter how long you've had it for.
Yeah, some of them can be unpredictable, that's true.
I've got a text here saying, "Morning, Trev. I picked up a 3-legged staffy that had bleeding toenails, looked like he'd gone through a long walk, took him to Keysborough shelter, and he was picked up and went home," says Martin. I love that idea that like you've got the acute fluffy dog that comes in there, then you've got your 3-legged staffy that's got one eye and a few teeth missing and half of his tail gnawed off.
They always go first.
Do they
The
really?
ones that are missing an eye or missing a leg, or they've got a really disgusting underbite, go first. We had a little dog that I actually stole from a pound. Geelong Animal Welfare had him. He was 13 years old, and he had a massive underbite with these massive saber-tooth teeth sticking out. And we gave him a dental, but we left the big teeth because they actually weren't interfering. He just looked weird. And this was about a month ago. And he was 13 years old, had no health problems. We put him up for adoption. He got snapped up. He was the strangest looking dog you've ever seen. But if they're missing an eye, missing a leg, weird underbite, they always get snapped up. People feel really sorry for them.
Pity. That's because people look at them and go, no one's ever going to take that dog.
Yeah, there's usually a demand over them.
T, good morning.
I'm sitting on the bed with Ruby. Ruby was she's a poopy kind of thing, and nobody wanted her, and she's in shelters and everything, and I said, yeah, I'll have her. And she seemed to be okay. Anyway, thing was, I'm old. I fell over. I could not get up off the ground. My husband was overseas. She dug a hole under the fence, went round to the neighbours, barked. I thought, this is pretty queer. They never let the dogs out. I've got 2 other dogs. They came round, found me on the floor, the next moment I was on the Royal Flying Doctor down to Perth.
Now, Dee, this is thanks to the dog that you got from the shelter.
Absolutely. You know,
Do you reckon that you get a better dog from the shelter than you will from anywhere else?
I don't know. She just so special. I guess she sort of thought, well, I've had such a horrific childhood, and now I'm in this beautiful home. So
Yeah, we'll look at. Well, hey, obviously she's looking after you, Dee. Serena, well, you can't really psychoanalyze dogs. However, do you think that they stop and they go, well, okay, I've got a second crack here. I'm going to even be better than when I first was with the first owner?
Absolutely, and I've got a story just like call it Dee's story. We had a little Jack Russell cross called Roxy last January last year, and she'd been in the shelter a little while. She hadn't really barked or had much personality, and a gentleman came in and he adopted her. 3 days later, he had his brain tumours and he had a seizure. And these neighbours knew he had a dog, but they hadn't met or heard her or anything like that. And she started barking and just barking and barking and barking, this very strange wailing bark. So they knew something was wrong, called the ambulance, the fire brigade came, broke down the door, and there's this little Jack Russell going nuts around her brand new owner. About a month later, a similar thing happened. He was unconscious again. She saved his life again. It was just an amazing little dog. And the previous owners had no indication that she would like this. So it's like she knew this gentleman was well, and she was his protector, and she saved his life twice. Amazing little dog.
Nice text from Tyler saying, I feel so sorry and sad for pets whose owners have passed away. They would be so used to being loved by their owners, and they must miss them dearly. Is that something you come across as well?
We do. We've got 2 Kelpies in at the moment one of their owners passed away, and their other owner went into a retirement home and couldn't take the dogs with her. So we've got them at the moment. We spend a lot of time giving them TLC. We've got an amazing group of volunteers who walk the dogs twice a day, just sit in the cages with them, cuddling them, and just trying to give them as much love as we can until we find them a home.
I'm going to get all teary in a minute.
Yeah, it's sad, but it's also very rewarding.
Yeah, it would be.
Yeah.
Hi, Jason.
I think it's just with that last story she said, I think it's kind of sad that we've come to a community. We're not even a community anymore where we can let our elderly have the animals that they've raised and shared. I think that's pretty sad that they won't let them have. I'm sure animals would be wonderful for the elderly.
Oh, you mean actually going into homes?
Well, why can't they keep why can't they keep their cats and dogs? And probably do them both good. But yes, why not have sheltered animals go into hospitals and I'm sure that would help. But,
I guess the difficulty there, Jason, though, I mean, I don't know, but the thing would be that if you have an area that is completely enclosed and everybody brings their pets in there could be complete and utter chaos.
Well, I'm sure, things can change. It just seems like as a community, as a nation, where we just become so fickle with things.
Yeah, I understand what you mean.
Yeah, but what I was actually ringing about now is I've got 2 small dogs and two cats. I'm ex-military. I've moved around a fair bit and never had them registered up until probably 6 months ago. The ranger came knocking, and of course my 2 little dogs had their nose sticking out the fence, and they wanted to know if they were mine, and I'm like, no. And then the cat proceeded to walk straight past her, and she goes, is that your cat? And I'm like, yeah. So yeah, in the end I was either pay registration for the remainder of the year for 4 animals or cop a fine. And when I started arguing about it, they wanted to then backdate it to the time I moved to that property.
Okay, so what's the question, Joe?
So what I want to know is why. I can understand having the microchip so you can find them, but what is the real reason, you couldn't tell me, on why actually I have to pay almost $200 for 4 animals?
If you were cynical, it could be because it's the way the councils can make money.
Yeah, but I'm paying a hell of a lot of rate, a hell of a lot of water.
Serena, do you know that? I mean, that's me being cynical, but I would presume there are other reasons.
Look, the main reason is to fund a lot of education programs in schools. The Department of Primary Industries in Victoria actually take a portion of the council registration fee to fund primary school programs, teaching kids how to approach a dog, those sorts of things. The other reason it actually funds the animal management team of that local council so that they can go and do the dog attack investigations, the barking dog complaints, catching those dogs that are off leash and taking them to the pound so they don't get hit by a car or cause an accident. So that's the actual real reason for that unit of the council.
Hello, Jeanette.
We had a little dachshund at the vet and it escaped. We loved this little dachshund. And we advertised everywhere, on the radio, everywhere. Well, eventually a pub phoned me up. They had found him. And I rushed down there and got hold of this little dachshund, brought him home. I was so excited. And then a friend of mine happened to be queuing up in the post office. And somebody was talking about a little dachshund that they had just lost. And I don't know, I just had a worry because this dog was found 40 miles away from our home, but the vet was down that way. Anyway, we put an advertisement in, and these people came running up, and it was their dog. And they were overwhelmed with joy. And I let this little dog go. I thought I'd found my baby, but we heard of sightings for him even 6 months later, but nobody could ever catch him.
You know, we had a dog wander in once that was a boxer cross Labrador, who she decided to wander in. She wandered into the house, walked in, Mum opened the door, she walked in, sat on Mum's knee, and then moved in. And we had to, and she had the most beautiful puppies about a month later, boxer Labrador crosses, which were beautiful pups. And then the owners found her. We found the owners, and it was so sad that she left us. She was a beautiful dog. Thank you, Jeanette. Now, we've been mainly talking about cats and dogs, Serena, but you would work with other animals as well.
Yeah, we do. Not as much, but we do work with rabbits, guinea pigs, the odd ferret as well. And we also work with a lot of wildlife. We treat about 1,000 head of wildlife a year, and a lot of that is made up with possums and birds, but we do get a few exotic species in often, then we transfer them to the zoos. We got a penguin in recently. We get swans in that have got fish hooks caught in their necks, which is always very sad, and we do everything we can to help them. Usually it's successful. We get lots of ducks. We've got a duck in at the moment. We get stray chickens that come in. It's quite funny. Get them.
Do you have any rabbits? Because you've got lots of people that have pet rabbits.
We do probably rehome about 70 rabbits a year. They take a lot longer to rehome. A lot of people want them when they're just tiny little bunnies, and they don't understand that they grow up into bigger rabbits. So they take a bit longer to rehome, but we do work with rabbits as well.
Horses?
No, we're based in North Melbourne, so we don't have any room for horses.
But are there other animal shelters that will do horses?
Absolutely. The RSPCA in Burwood and on their regional centres do horses as well.
Okay. So you will take a pet, and as long as it hasn't got a bad attitude, and as long as it's not too sick, because you'll obviously look after them as well, you will keep them until you find a home.
Absolutely. And sometimes when we do fall in love with a pet that we're not allowed to rehome because they're deemed, they've got a life-threatening condition, usually a staff member takes them on as a permanent foster. And I did the same thing last year. I had an 11-year-old Burmese. He had 5 things wrong with him. He had diabetes, kidney failure, hypertension, arthritis and dental disease. And there was just no way I was putting this cat down. He was just divine. And I ended up taking him on for another 8 months until he passed away. So that happens a lot with the staff. We have over 220 staff members at the hospital and in the shelter itself. So a lot of those animals don't get put down. They actually go home with the staff.
Oh, geez, you're up for a knighthood or well, you'll be the next knight, so you'll be getting on.
Look, you get a lot back.
It'll be Dame Serena.
And anyhow, I came back and he decided he had some of my food, and I told him it's time to go, and anyhow, he just jumped in my car and refused to get out. I pulled him out, back in and went, he just wouldn't go.
Liked you.
Anyhow, well, he knew that, this is a mum. I could rule her all I like. And anyhow, so home he came, and I took him to the vet. I rang, trying to find nobody wanted him, so he stayed with me, and I get a bit teary now. The vet thought he was about 4 or 3 when he came to me, and he died on the 21st of December last year.
Okay.
So he was their age.
How long did you have him for in the end?
About 14 years.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, wonderful.
That's a good life.
And he was just so beautiful, and I loved him dearly. And then about 3 years ago, about 11:30, on the 29th of December, he was on the bed, and I pulled the curtains back, and it was hot and whatever, and he was going berserk and tearing up down the bed, barking and telling me there's something out there, and I kept telling him, no, there is, da-da-da-da-da. So I said, I'll open the door, you can go down and have a look. And when I opened the door and walked down the steps to the path, I saw this round something that moved. And I walked up, it went off the front of my driveway onto the road, but only for about 3 feet, and it just sat there. And it was a little dog. He was about 12 months old, he was only tiny. He didn't want to come in the gate, but he sat there, he didn't go any further, so I went, got a chicken neck for him, and I broke it into the vertebrae, the vertebrae, so I could lay a little trail, because I thought if I get him inside the gate, he'll be safe.
And how did it turn out, Jeanette?
Yes, there he is at the bottom of the bed.
Oh, that's lovely. People have got such touching stories, Serena. I've got a text here that I should point out because it looks at the other side. It said, it all sounds well and good, but we got our daughter a dog from a shelter, and it passed all the behaviour courses, and it bit their 6-year-old son, and then went on to maul a little dog, and it ended up cost about $2,000. The only thing the shelter did was to take it back, but did not reimburse any money. I would presume that there aren't always going to be perfect stories, but that brings up the responsibility of the shelter, I guess, Serena.
Well, I mean, the shelter can only do what it can do. We're not responsible for long-term things that happen in society. So if the dog is, not on a lead, or the owners aren't doing the right thing by the dog, or they put it in situations, at the end of the day, they're animals and they're going to react unpredictably. We can only do the checks and balances that we can do in the shelter. We also rehome them with what we think is the appropriate family. So we'll have dogs that we'll say aren't suitable with toddlers, aren't suitable because they're a bit boisterous, they might knock them over, or suitable for a teenager, those sorts of things. And if someone then puts it in a situation that we don't think it's suitable for, we can't control that. So absolutely, we'll do everything we can to try and match it to the perfect family, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of variables in society that happen that we simply can't control for, and they are an animal at the end of the day with their own brains.
Gary, good morning.
Yeah, I was just thinking, there's another pet too that you have to think about too, as the generational birds, cockatoos and large. Well, it depends on when people actually buy them and that, because, say, people get them, say when they're about 50 or something like that, they're going to have to pass them on to the kids and that, whether the kids want them or not too, so that's something you've got to think about. And also reptiles, and a lot of people, has got them and probably wouldn't want to pass them off to anyone else, but their kids or something like that, whether they want them or not too.
Yeah. Serena,
Yeah, well, we do rehome birds, and there's different birds have different wildlife requirements. Reptiles, we don't have a licence to rehome, but we do actually treat them at the hospital. We have lots of reptiles that come in as private patients, and then if someone wants to surrender them, we take them to the appropriate place, which is there's a North Reptile Home World and places like that. So we just refer them to the appropriate agency.
Good stuff. Betty, good morning. Hi, Betty.
I'm just wondering if obviously the lady how to start one from the last many little had in the home and from the dog's homes, and she is now, I've had her for 2 years and she's 13 now, and I'm 90. Now occasionally I have to go into hospital for maybe 2 or 3 days, not long. But I'm always worried about my dog. My family love her and have her, but they've also got dogs and cats. She is not very keen on that. And I'm wondering, do they have a program where my family can bring her there until I get home from hospital?
That's such a good point, Serena. I don't know if you take that on as a responsibility, but there are You do?
Yeah, we do. We have limited space because we are predominantly an animal shelter, but we do have a few cages in the cattery and the kennels that we dedicate to what we call our emergency boarding program. Obviously, those cages get filled up very quickly, and we have to assess each case by case. But we absolutely offer that service. One of the requirements is that we have a caseworker, so that because some people do leave their animal and then they go missing in action, so we do need a caseworker that we can liaise with while that person is either being evicted or they're in hospital, whatever the reason is, and then that way we can keep in contact with them and also give them updates on how their dog or cat is going.
That's good. It's just that I got you from the Lawsmith, and I'm just so worried in case she has to go to strangers who don't understand.
That's right.
If anything happens to me at 90, who knows, she would be in a place where she could be rehoused anyway.
Well, they sound like lovely people at Lawsmith, Betty.
Yes, they are lovely people, and I've got a lot from the Jaws at Geelong. I've had lots from there, and they do know the Jaws, the hospital down there.
Jaws.
And the Jaws is called Geelong Animal Welfare Service, and that's also a good place. But so I know that my family can contact Lord Smith now if I have to go into hospital.
That's right.
And bring her into you.
Yeah, Betty, thank you. That's such a good point, Serena. And is that means tested? Or how do you work out? Because there are people who can obviously afford to put their animals into shelter.
That's right, and we've had situations where people have said that they're homeless, and we found out they went to Hawaii for 2 weeks. So then they came back and picked up the animal, which was really awful for us because it was also over Christmas when we're completely full to the brim, and we're trying to do everything we can to help these animals when people can just go and pay boarding fees out of the commercial boarding place. We're developing the program at the moment to involve commercial boarding places that will do it also, and we'll coordinate the program and put the animals in commercial boarding at no cost. And we have some criteria. Like I said, a caseworker is usually the main criteria for it. And the biggest reason is usually homelessness, that the animals come to us in that state. The animals are usually in fantastic condition, but the person's either been evicted or they're trying to find more temporary housing, and the current housing they're in won't let them take the animal with them. So that's usually the biggest reason. And the second biggest would be domestic violence. A lot of people won't leave a situation because they fear what's going to happen to the animal, which we'll be there to help them.
Oh, that's such a good idea too.
Yeah.
Why do you think that getting a dog from an adoption centre or a shelter or from the pound is a good place to go to start if you're wanting to get a certain pet?
Look, I think you've just got so many beautiful stories there, and we have a range of animals. We do get the odd puppy, but normally we've got lots of animals that haven't had a really good start because the owner hasn't done the training, done the hard yards, and those dogs are usually so appreciative of any love that you give them that they usually make really good pets. So normally you're pretty guaranteed to get a good animal out of it that will just give you lots of unconditional love.
I've got a text here talking about cat flu and asking whether or not the animals are checked over in a huge way when they first arrive.
Absolutely. So every animal that comes in, whether it's returning back from foster care or it's come in as it's been surrendered, is vet checked. Usually that's done within 12 hours, just depending on the vet's schedule, of course. And then they start their vaccination process. Most animals will have a series of 2 vaccinations a month apart, just depending on how long they're in the shelter for. And then if they get adopted prior to their last vaccination, we offer a discount after they leave the shelter, and then they can come back and have their follow-up vaccinations.
And people, because I noticed when I took Snoop the dog to the emergency hospital place, they do have the option there for people to donate, and they just say that it's important for the continuation of the services.
That's right, yeah. And we have donation bins all around our hospital and shelter. We actually just did a Valentine's Day fundraiser at all the CBD train stations the other morning. We took our shaker tins, and I took a beautiful shelter dog, a big Irish Wolfhound Cross Labrador with me, and they sit down, I'd shake the tin and you kiss the tin, and it was just a very fun morning getting out there and collecting donations.
Serena, it's been wonderful talking to you this morning and taking calls from people, and it gives us a little bit of an insight into what actually happens in animal shelters compared to what we perhaps read in the papers.
Great, thank you very much for your time.
Serena Hogg is the General Manager of the Lort Smith Adoption Centre.
How's this for a pub? must be the lookout up there.
doesn't really fit the strict definition or diagnostic criteria for an autoimmune encephalitis.
So you don't have any idea of what may have caused it in her particularly?
Well, we've investigated her extensively. Mariana has a background family history of psychological stress that would actually predispose people to say that this is more psychiatric. The interesting thing we're finding in some animal studies is that those types of stresses actually cause immune changes in the brain. So whether that's a predisposition or not, I don't know. But generally outside the case of where there's a tumour and immune response, I suppose you can basically say that there was probably a similar response but not to a tumour where they saw this particular protein. It's all about the environment that the immune system finds itself in.
Is it likely that this type of condition has something to tell us about that relationship between the mind and the body?
It's intimately connected. It certainly shows the immune system has access to the brain, which for many years the brain was thought to be so-called immune privilege. In other words, the immune system didn't do much there, but we now know that it does in various ways. The main message for me is really that there are a lot of factors that go along in the body that affect the brain, and many of those have been in the media, but there's still a hell of a lot of research that needs to be done for us to understand it.
Professor David Brown. You're with All in the Mind on RN. I'm Lynn Malcolm. We're hearing about 18-year-old Mariana Tana's mysterious and terrifying condition, which caused her brain to become inflamed. Her symptoms appeared to be psychiatric, but it was later found that they were caused by a rare and newly discovered autoimmune disease. Anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis was first described only 10 years ago. I asked David Brown how likely it is that many people with this condition have been misdiagnosed.
Definitely people have been underdiagnosed, and there are cases in the literature where people with severe psychiatric disease probably had this condition or other antibody-mediated conditions. This is probably one of the most common, but there are definitely other antibody-mediated diseases that affect the brain and can present in a psychiatric manner. And we know that there are cases where we can't find an antibody. Now, whether that's because we haven't got the test to find the antibodies, there are new antibodies being described all the time. It doesn't really involve antibodies, we just don't know.
And so how was Mariana treated?
So Mariana was treated by filtering the antibodies out of the blood, and although she had severe disease, she's really on the lower spectrum of symptomatology. She also had immunosuppression in the form of tablets to continually damp down the immune response.
I had the cannula in my chest that was funneling down to my heart, and then I had the plasmapheresis, and I had that once every 2.
Here's Trevor Chappell.
Alison Weir is the author of Anne Boleyn, A King's Obsession. We've spoken to her before about Catherine of Aragon. She's written a series on the 6 Tudor queens. Alison, hello.
Hello, Trevor. How are you?
I'm good, Alison. Firstly, the title of the book is A King's Obsession. In what way was she a king's obsession?
I think that last Henry was, but she certainly was. I mean, she did produce and he was absolutely passionate about her, and he was told he sees nothing, he speaks of nothing, he thinks of nothing but this, and he cannot be for an hour without her. But clearly it was an obsession.
But he's a king with obsessions, because he had an obsession with her sister.
Well, we don't know whether it's an obsession. It was a brief affair. It didn't last very long, a year or so. And we don't actually know anything about the nature of that affair or his feelings for her, whether it was just a physical fling or whether there actually was something going on between them. There just isn't the evidence.
Is that where, though, the relationship with him came from, or where did the relationship with him, with Henry, come from?
What, between Henry and Anne?
Yes.
Yeah, well, he noticed her when she was at the English court serving his wife, maid of honour, to Catherine of Aragon. And she had various admirers, and the king was in competition with the poet Sir Thomas Wyatt. And there was a bit of jealousy going on. Of course, Henry, being the king, won. So that's how it came about. And he became, first of all, he tried to get her to become his mistress in the accepted sense. She wouldn't, she said no. And then he tried to get her to become his mistress in the courtly sense, in which she would have mastery over him as her servant. It's all part of a game of courtly love. There's not a physical relationship. But she refused to do that as well. So then he decided he wanted to marry her. And he was set on that course, and he was absolutely single-minded about it. That was what he wanted to do. And it took him 7 years to do it.
And which is a long time, and which shows
a very long time.
He was quite patient then, because she was already married, wasn't she?
No, she wasn't married at all. No.
She was close to marriage?
No, she had a couple of years before Henry became interested in her, she'd become involved and possibly pre-contracted herself, which is like an engagement, to the son of the Earl of Northumberland, young Henry Percy. That was broken up by Cardinal Wolsey, probably because the daughter of a knight wasn't a fit wife for the son of an earl. And Henry Percy had been promised to someone else, had been formalised, but he was rushed away from court and hastened into marriage.
It's interesting you mentioned Cardinal Wolsey, because his name comes up a little bit as far as she's concerned. What was the relationship there?
Well, she hated him. I mean, they were told by a reliable witness that when this happened, she smoked. She was absolutely furious. She was banished to Hever Castle, her family home, and didn't come back to court for a year or so. And I think she had counted Wolsey, she blamed Wolsey for what had happened. And she was clearly in love with Percy, or certainly what he was with her. It does seem to be a romance. And the prospect of being married to an earl, being lady, a high-ranking peeress, would have been very attractive to a girl from an ambitious family as the Boleyns were.
Alison, how did Wolsey have so much power over her, though?
Henry gave Wolsey a lot of power. Wolsey had been entrenched in power for some years before this happened, for at least a decade. Wolsey proved himself indispensable to Henry, and by about 1519, people saying that originally Wolsey was saying the king would do so and so, then it was we will do so and so, and by 1519 it was I will do so and so.
What was the relationship between Anne's and Mary's, for that matter, father as well?
Between Anne and Mary?
Yeah, and their father.
And their father. They were very supportive and ambitious family to a point. We don't know how far Thomas Boleyn pushed his daughters in the direction of the king. He got certain awards at this time, certain preferments and offices, but he served the king for a very long time and was a close friend. These are the sort of benefits you would have expected him to get at this stage of his career. And we do read that when Anne had finally agreed to marry Henry, he said, "We must tell your father." And it's possible that Anne made her own choices without any help from her father.
Why is it she eventually agreed to marry?
She wants the crown. I'm sure that's the key to it. Whether she wants the man who could give her the crown as much is a matter of debate, because we have 17 beautiful love letters from Henry to Anne, passionate love letters. They're in the Vatican Library now. We don't have her replies, and that deprives us of valuable insights into how she felt about Henry and indeed into her character.
I think it's interesting because she was...
70 days.
She was in prison for treason, wasn't she?
Yes, she was.
And what was considered to be the treasonous thing that she did?
Well, the worst treason she's supposed to have committed was plotting the king's assassination. But she was also accused of adultery with 5 men, one of whom was her own brother. And they threw in the charge of plotting the king's death so that she could marry one of her lovers and rule in the name of her daughter Elizabeth. And it's just insane, because the king is her only protector. She's friendless. She hasn't got any support base. The king's love is the only thing that saves her from disaster. So why would she try to destroy the king?
So let's go back then and talk about, they marry, and what is life like for her initially in the marriage?
Well, she's triumphant, of course, when the marriage takes place. She's pregnant, confidently expected to bear the king, the son he's long wanted, and she had a lavish coronation. Absolutely, Henry, you know, it spares no expense, and lots of pageantry. And then, of course, things start to fall apart because he strays. And it's typical of the king. He would stray when his wives were pregnant because sex during pregnancy was taboo. And so he had an affair, and she went mad. She reprimanded him for it. It's the first real crack in the marriage, and he told her to shut her eyes and endure as more worthy persons had done. They made it up, but then of course she bore not a son but a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth.
Because she would have been very aware of what he was like, though, especially given that he wanted her to be a mistress, and that also there's the possibility that her sister was also a mistress. So why was she so surprised when it happened?
Because I think, yes, it is a true saying that a man who marries his mistress creates a vacancy. But all through these 7 years of their courtship, there's no evidence that Henry was ever unfaithful to Anne, and he was passionate about her. And he'd been, as far as we know, he'd been completely true to her. So it must have come as a shock. It was the first indication he had that he was beginning.
Was she naive?
No, I don't think she was. But I think she so took his love for granted that's why it came as a shock.
Because she seems, when you take a look at her beforehand, she seems like a very strong woman as well.
She was. But of course, don't forget, before marriage, we're talking about an age of courtly love in which she has mastery over him. He sets her up on a pedestal as his mistress in the courtly sense. And then, of course, that's the end, she becomes the mistress in the real sense. And she calls the tune. But as soon as they're married, the roles reverse. Henry expects her to be the traditional submissive wife. And this is where things begin to go wrong, because she's used to being quite autonomous, to making her own choices and decisions, and to driving affairs, and things are changing. She cannot acclimatise herself to the change.
We can go back a little bit. Was her mother a strong woman?
We don't know. Her mother's quite a shadowy figure. I found some evidence that suggests that the marriage between Sir Thomas Boleyn and his wife Elizabeth Howard was not a happy one. There's some evidence that she had a reputation for being unfaithful.
Ah, great.
And they were rarely at court. They were caught together sometimes, but her mother seems to have taken in the country. He was castle quite a lot.
There was a bit of that going on.
Her mother.
There was a bit of that going on, wasn't there?
Oh, there was. An awful lot of it. She would call it a hotbed of intrigue and affair.
Which is what makes your book so interesting, because it's full of...
Oh, thank you very much. Plenty of the rich material for them.
Richard, good morning.
Morning to you, Trevor, and your guest. I'd just like to say that possibly this occurrence of the beheading is the single most important, in my studies, event in the human race for female equality. Down through the ages since, women have come to the fore, and I believe that the king actually felt threatened by her intelligence. It's my opinion. I still hold it today. And as you see women rising in society, and men have felt threatened by this, goes back to that day when he decided, or they decided, to get rid of her, and I think it was a terrible thing. And from now on, we can see the events unfolding even to this very day.
Richard, that's a really interesting point. Alison, was it more than just the fact that he didn't bear a son? Was there more to it than that?
I think that's the question, but I think that you have to look at the way Henry, but the way monarchy regarded it. There was a law of monarchy that was sanctified at the coronation, set apart, and seen as not quite mortal. If anyone who commits a crime against the king, the lord of monarchy, is guilty of treason, which is seen as the most heinous of crimes. And Henry was presented with evidence of infidelity and posing plot to assassinate him that he couldn't ignore. And once he was skeptical at first, but once he was given more evidence, he distanced himself immediately, cut himself off from her, and that's the normal way of Henry's behaving.
So it wasn't the relationship that he had with her, it was other people wanting to plot her downfall.
Oh yes, there was a great coalition of very unlikely allies in some cases at court that began forming several months before, and the aim was to bring her down, probably to arrange to enable a divorce or annulment. But Thomas Cromwell gets his because Anne's power, and Brexit's power, it would have been his neck or hers. She's made that quite clear. So he did agree absolutely right to constructive his case against her.
We'll come back to that. Moira, good morning.
Hello, Trevor. Alison, is it?
Yes.
Oh, hi. Hello. It's fascinating. I mean, I've always felt so very sorry that she died and left a child. She had to leave that child, and that child, to my mind, was really when the break came with the Catholic Church, not under Henry VIII, and not really. But what do you see as her influence in relation to the break with Catholicism?
Alison?
And it's very strong. Anne's book she gave Henry to read 3 years before the Reformation happened. Actually, her inspiration, this is what the things Henry was reading in them, was what actually happened in the end. So Anne is influential. She put these ideas in Henry's head. Little they may have been there in part beforehand, but they crystallised when he read them. He said, this is a book for me and Hawkins to read. You read those texts, they're quite startling.
So that split from the Catholic Church, because the way I always understood it was because Henry wanted to marry her, and the only way he could do it was to create that split, but there was more to it than that.
There was more to it than that, because for years there had been complaints about the abuses within the Catholic Church. Martin Luther protested against them in 1517, so found the Protestant religion. And Anne wasn't a Protestant, she was a reformist. She was the party that wanted reform of the church from within. She was never a Protestant, neither was Henry.
So this gave an opportunity to create that split?
It is. It was one of the reasons. And don't forget that Henry stole the monasteries as well. That was one of the other ideas of the really bad text. And the monasteries, there was a rather outrageous movement. There had only been 2 new foundations in England in the 15th century. And therefore, monasticism was coming in some ways to be done with movement. It might have happened, the dissolution might have happened in one form or another, sooner or later.
So is it possible that Anne would have said to him, okay, if you want us to be married, the only way that we can do it is if we split, if we actually get rid of our association with the Catholic Church?
Well, Henry himself spent in some time. Whether the idea originally came from Anne is not recorded. She certainly put these ideas into his head and showed him these texts. It was his decision to split with Rome. And but a lot of people have the same opinion, notably Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Cranmer, and the Reformed Party of court.
So Cromwell would have been on her side as far as that was concerned?
He was to start, but then she opposed them. Their policies were divided later on. They became rivals. He wanted to make the king rich. She boasted of making the richest sovereign Christian. And he was going to do that through the wealth generated by the dissolution of the monarchy. Anne wanted that wealth diverted to education and charitable purposes. So there's a split there. But Anne is a Francophile. Her instinct leads towards France, but Cromwell against this great enemy, the Holy Roman Empire, where England had lucrative trade markets. So there's this big divide here, and Anne's the stumbling block to peace with the empire. The Holy Roman Emperor is Catherine's nephew.
So if that relationship is combative and is married to the king, then how is it that they managed to get into the king's ear above her?
Because her power was undermined by the fact that she continually failed to bear a son. Of 3 pregnancies, she had one daughter, one living daughter, probably a son that was born at full term, another late miscarriage probably of a son, and a miscarriage at 15 weeks of a son. It undermined her power. And with Henry's increasing concern that God wasn't smiling on this marriage either, because he should the sons were dying or born dead, Anne is becoming increasingly vulnerable.
Riley, good morning.
Good morning, TC and Alison.
Good morning.
Just like to say, as an observation, with the split from the Catholic Church, that was the catalyst to why man has gone on and effectively dominated the planet, come up with, all the technologies, because instead of the Pope basically controlling the royal families of Europe and having basically one train of thought, with that split from the Church of England, basically created competition within mankind in Europe.
And so it basically pushed forward the ideas of free thinking.
Absolutely.
A thought on that also?
Yes, it did. There were all sorts of sects springing up throughout Europe, some extreme Protestant sects like Calvinism, and there were Anabaptists. And Henry VIII, though, was just a dim view. He remained a Catholic. For him, the changes meant that he would be head of the Church in England, not the Pope, and he would have a chance to institute true doctrine in his church, which did remain Catholic.
And so he didn't really want to see that much of a change.
No, he did. He made a few changes, but because he didn't like anything that smacks of papistry.
Reichenbach Memorial Park.
So during this period of time where there's a division and there's competition with Cromwell, what was Anne Boleyn's life like just on a day-to-day basis? What was she doing? Because it was interesting you say that she was a reformist and she was wanting to see things like more education. Is that something she worked on a lot?
Yes, she did take an interest in education. She also had patronised reformers and reformist bishops. I think 10 were appointed during her time as Queen, so that shows her influence working behind the scenes. She was the head of a powerful faction at court from her family and friends and supporters, but she managed to alienate quite a few of them, and she was becoming increasingly insecure. She felt she was watched. She displayed immoderate behaviour. People startling 1 or 2 ambassadors in the process, and she clearly was very feeling, as I say, very, very insecure.
What was her relationship like with her sister once she became Queen?
Not good. Mary Boleyn had been widowed in some years, 5 years beforehand, and her father refused to take her in, and the king had forced him to take Mary into his house at Hever. Mary was at Anne's coronation. She served in her household, but she disappeared from court for a time because she had young children.
Wow.
And when she turned up again in 1534,
How pretty is this?
And she was quite obvious when she was quite obviously pregnant. And it turned out she had made a marriage with a man. Which was scandalised the belief that Anne felt affronted because as Queen she was head of the family, and as Queen her position should have been sought. And the result was that Mary was banished from court. And Mary wrote this letter to Thomas Cromwell begging him to use his influence, have her reinstated. And but she didn't write a very appealing letter because at one point it's a mere the Alno that she said, oh, I'd rather be, you know, get my word with a man who loves me to be the great and queen cricket. It was a real big event.
I bet Dad was pleased, though, that she become queen.
Yeah. Well, Anne wasn't very happy, and Mary went to live in Calais with her husband, and the sisters never saw each other again.
But Mr. Boleyn was pleased?
Well, we don't know. That's not recorded.
Okay.
What's so frustrating, Mary's life is very obscure. It's we just don't have the evidence, but we do know that there are these landmark moments in it that give us a hint. In this paragraph in this letter, we can hint at the relationship between the sisters.
Elias asked the question whether or not Henry was just a big spoiled brat.
He could be described in that way, yes, because he's every whim of being himself. He was clearly his mother's favourite, and her loss, you know, his father overprotected him. And yet when he came to the throne, he inherited a huge fortune and scourged it all on courtly and famous and vainglorious wars. Women came to him at the crook of his little finger, with half a man, that is. And, you know, he could indulge all his life. So, yes, when someone like the Pope said no to him, the reaction was predictable.
Given the relationship between Anne and Cromwell isn't that good, and that they're speaking not particularly favourably about her to Henry, what is she doing at that time? Is she protesting and saying, well, look, what they're saying, this isn't true?
No, she isn't, because at the time they were still gathering the men, she was isolated. She had a miscarriage at the end of January. She miscarried her son at the end of January 1536. Whereupon she was recovering at Greenwich and Henry didn't put her on. She just had her written about her. She knew that she was messages to the female who was making a second from her at Greenwich. She come back to court for several weeks, and she was making a time with Scottish gathering momentum. But it's secret, it's kept secret. People don't reveal their hands. Anne definitely realised something was going on, because a day or so before her arrest, at the beginning of May, she charged her chaplain to look to Elizabeth's welfare in case anything happened to her. And she was seen pleading at a window with the king with Elizabeth in her arms, obviously for emotional effect. So she knew something was going on, but she was completely shocked by her arrest.
So it happened fairly quickly, because if you're saying, like, within a few weeks, that's very fast.
It did happen very quickly. And once she was, because Cromwell had to move quickly, because had Anne had a chance to work her wiles on Henry as she had done, through all their spectacular falling out, as the Spanish ambassador testified, you know, she knew how to rule him. She could get him back on side. So that's why Cromwell had to move quickly.
Did she have her supporters?
They all fell away, as you can imagine.
Just in case.
Well, if you see, man by man, you suddenly realise some of the leading courtiers of her circle are suddenly absent from court, and then one by one others are arrested. You can imagine the terror that's going around the court. There are people saying, they're going to be me next, because some of these people had no obvious connection.
So quite literally.
And seven men were arrested with her, 2 were freed.
Who were the people that were her supporters up till, like, at that point?
Would have been her faction, but she managed to alienate a lot of them. Even her uncle, the powerful Duke of Norfolk, who helped to head her faction, she'd fallen out with him. She'd used words to him as she said, he was used to a dog. And she alienated officers of the king's household, and she still had some friends, but even women in her own household were willing to testify against her.
So not only did they not support her, they testified against her.
They did, absolutely.
So she would have felt incredibly betrayed.
Yes, she did have done. But then don't forget, she didn't know, and she would have had no way of knowing, because as soon as she was arrested, she was told, she was called before the council on the 2nd of May, told that she was charged with, taken back to her apartment under guard, sat with her ladies with a rather deviltry dinner, and was arrested at 2 o'clock and had to wait until 5 to be taken to the Tower. She would have had very little opportunity, unwatched, to have spoken to any of her women. She might have worried, she might not have put 2 and 2 together, because they testified against her. She didn't know the evidence. Her executive were not allowed to see the evidence or have representation. And they saw the evidence only when they went to court.
So no representation?
No. You refuse to treason, you weren't allowed to know. You're allowed to defend yourself in response to charges.
Vivian, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, Vivian.
I just
I'm in the process of actually reading Alison's latest book on Anne Boleyn. Oh, hello, Alison.
Hello.
I tend to think that with Henry, that he was a weak man, and
Heading?
No, it was a private one. Although 1,000 people were allowed into the palace because justice had to be seen to be done, foreigners were not admitted. And I think there was some sort of paranoia work here because, and it's the reason why Henry sent for the sword of Calais to decapitate Anne in the continental manner by sword, because they didn't want a bungled execution and a scandal that would be reverberated across Europe. Look what happened to Queen of England, butchered to death. So the sword of Calais was brought in because he was experienced, because the English executioner was a hangman. He had hardly any experience in cutting off heads.
Jeez. So...
Yeah, no, I won't elaborate. Quite grim, actually.
I was getting into that bit, that's really good.
You don't want people thinking, what did I do it today?
Who were the 1,000 people that were allowed in?
The public. But they were screened quite carefully. The British Council were there. The King's bastard son, the Duke of Richmond, was there, representing his father, although the King, of course, did not defend. Had nothing to do, as I said, he had nothing to do with anything that would be tainted with treason. And most of them were either the Lord Mayor was there, the citizens of London, the public were allowed in, just the foreigners were left out.
Alison, we've got a minute to go till the news. How do you think that she'll be remembered?
It worries me that she's remembered as a sort of historical celebrity and a very romanticised figure. And I think that tragic figure on the scaffold is overlaid with the perception we have of the earlier man, the one who isn't such an attractive and courageous character. So that concerns me. I think it's like an unstoppable roller coaster. I think it's too real man to live down.
And then we should learn, because I didn't know anything about her wishes for education and that sort of stuff. That's the sort of thing that we should also be looking at?
Yes, we should. I mean, there is a very serious side to her, and we have to admire her for the influence that she had in regard to the Reformation. Of course, that's where you're coming from. You can't admire her power, the way she used her way to power. I think she was quite a vengeful person.
And Alison, these are the things that we'll find out.
Welcome to Books Plus on RN, Radio Australia and online. I'm Kate Evans with an interview recorded late last year as a special event for the Sydney Writers' Festival. There I spoke to Australian writer and journalist Geraldine Brooks, long-time resident of the US. Her latest novel is The Secret Chord, a story of King David. She spoke to me in front of a large and enthusiastic crowd. Hi Geraldine.
Oh, hi Kate.
Now we're going to be talking about your latest book, The Secret Chord, but I wonder if we could start with the many different types of writing that you brought to it. Now you were always a letter writer and reader. You had pen friends all over the world as a child. What did that teach you about what words and stories could do?
I think it taught me about the magical relationship between the writer and the reader, because my pen pals that I acquired in Europe and the Middle East and the United States were people onto whom I projected all these fantasies about their lives. You know, I'm growing up in the western suburbs of Sydney at a time when we lived in a pretty small world, really. It wasn't an expansive place like it is now. You know, the culture was quite enclosed. So I fantasized that these kids elsewhere were having much more romantic and adventurous lives. And then, you know, later on when I went to meet them, not so much. and that's the sort of, I think about this now when people say, well, what do you want the reader to get out of your novel? I wouldn't presume to say, because I think it's this fantastic connection that happens when somebody picks up a book and they bring their own experience and their own needs to the book, and they find in it things that you didn't even, as the writer, necessarily mean to put there. And so I think that's what the correspondence with all those hapless kids taught me.
But by presenting international stories, is that what then propelled you into journalism and to ultimately becoming a foreign correspondent?
Well, I wasn't thinking foreign correspondent, but I was thinking journalist from a very young age. I was about 8, and I had a dentist's appointment in town, which was a big deal for us, so my mum said, we'll go and see Dad at work, and Dad was a proofreader on the Women's Weekly and the Daily Telly in those days, and so we went to the Consolidated Press building, and the presses were still bare in those days, and it was right at the time that the afternoon edition of the book, and it was a magical place, the huge, spidery liner type machines grabbing the type, and the big ink truck had just injected all this ink into the cisterns under the building, and there was a sort of inky smell in the air. And then the foreman hit the big red button that made the presses run, and the newsprint is spooling so fast that it's a blur, and then he reaches for the paper and he grabs one and he hands it to me, and it's warm. It's hot off the presses. And I looked down and I read whatever the headline was, and I thought, I'm the first one in the city that knows what's going on here. And from that 8-year-old time, I just wanted to be a journalist, but I was not thinking foreign correspondent, not thinking war correspondent, as maybe some sedate job covering the theatre.
But you did become a foreign correspondent, and one of the things that you describe in your book, 9 Parts of Desire, is reaching a point where you're so constrained by the cultures that you're in the Middle East that you have to find other ways to tell the stories. You have to find other almost doorways into the story. What did you do?
So, I had my experience as a reporter on the Sydney Morning Herald, and then, very briefly I worked in the United States, and it's so easy, if you want to find out what ordinary people are thinking, you walk into a pub or a bar and you sit down and you ask them, no big deal. For a woman in many countries in the Middle East, A, there are no bars, and B, you walk into the equivalent, which is a coffee shop, and either one of two things happens. It either clears out like a nuclear bomb just exploded, or people start hitting on you, or at least they did in those days when I was somewhat younger. And so I couldn't do the kind of bottom-up reporting that I like to do with ordinary people and getting their opinions. I was sort of reduced to this horrible business of getting official interviews where you sit in a gilded salon with a second secretary for something or other and get lied to. And head of state interviews interested me not at all, because they didn't get to be the head of state by telling some reporter anything important. So I was really basically biting the carpet in frustration about how to do this job, when I realized that I did have an opportunity that was open to me as a woman, which was to tell the story through the women of the region. And once I had that epiphany and went about my reporting that way, not only did I get access to an incredibly rich and important story of what was happening with women who were embracing a more radical or orthodox Islam, but it also gave me access to the men in their lives in a much more culturally acceptable way.
Does that experience haunt this latest novel in some way, given that you were in the
I
Middle
think it
East?
informs it very much. I was thinking about many of those women as I was trying to see this world of King David's wives, the women in his life who have a lot in common with many of the women I reported on, in that they're living in a very male-dominated society where they don't have any public power, where their lives can be very precarious, where decisions are made for them by somebody else. But as a correspondent who was very interested in women's experiences, I learned that that's not the full picture, that there's a lot of private power that women are able to wield. And, you know, I can give you a couple of examples of that.
Please.
Yeah. So one very weird afternoon, I was invited home by Mrs. Ayatollah Khomeini. This is not a name many people can drop, but Khadija Khomeini was very gracious, and she's given me tea, and she's trying to tell me what a great guy the Ayatollah was, and what a fantastic husband, and how when her babies were little, he would get up in the night and feed them. And so I came home and I told this story to an Iranian refugee dissident friend of mine, and she said, yes, he fed the babies. But did she say what he fed them to? But the point of that is that her father didn't think much of Ruhollah from Khomeini when he came as a young, impoverished religious student seeking her hand. But she, in the traditions of a very conservative family in that time and place, was allowed to bring in the tea. She's completely covered in her chador, but she brings in the tea and she sees this guy. She thinks he's hot. And when her father says he's not suitable, she thinks, So she has a very convenient dream that night that Ruhollah, the religious student, is sitting with all the prophets of Islam, being treated by them as their equal. And she tells that to her father. And suddenly the marriage is going ahead. So, you know, that's an example of private power very quietly wielded. And 99% of Iranians probably couldn't tell you that Khomeini's wife's first name is Khadija because she lived so privately. But the elite knew very well that if you wanted to get something put in front of Khomeini, you went through her.
And you worked that out by going into the side doors, entering the women's quarter, sitting down and having tea. I wonder if there's an analogy there to what you're doing by writing historical fiction. Are you finding other doorways into the history, other ways into the stories in order to make sense of it?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things as a reporter that is, you know, the glory of journalism is you don't write it if you can't prove it. So even if you have a very strong opinion on what might have happened, you cannot print that unless you can source it. And with fiction, when you come to that roadblock, when you can't know for sure what happened, then that's when the novelist's work begins. That's when you imagine. You try and make an empathetic leap and say, maybe it happened like this. And so, yeah, it is these stories from the past where you can report it out to a certain extent, but then you come to that place where the line of fact frays and disappears. And that's when you make the swan dive into imagination.
There are other things, though, that drove you into the world of the imagination, I think. And I just read an essay that you wrote in a collection called Mothers and Others about mothering and careers and so on. And you talked about stopping being a journalist and the sort of freedom that fiction gave you. Can you explain what happened?
What happened? Yes, well, I always tell people that I have the Nigerian secret police to thank, both for my experience as a mother and my fiction career, because I really loved being a foreign correspondent. I was lost in that world. It was completely consuming, and I thought it was, you know, a really great privilege to be a witness to history and to hope that you might be, by, you know, reporting the truth, able to shape things in a more positive direction sometimes. And I was so distracted by it that, you know, I was 39 years old and I hadn't considered doing anything else. And then I was reporting in Nigeria about Shell Oil being in collusion with the brutal military dictatorship of the time, Sani Abacha's rule, and how Shell had called in the military to fire on peaceful farmers who were protesting Shell's despoliation of their land. And I'd gone around doing what you do, getting the evidence of that there actually had been live fire massacres of these people who were unarmed, and then I had, as you do, went to the military to get their side of the story. Big mistake. They handed me over to the secret police and they threw me in a lockup, fingerprinted, mugshot. I had no idea how long they were going to keep me, and I thought, I'm 39 years old and I forgot to get pregnant. And if they keep me even 18 months, maybe I blew that. And it was the first time that I'd even considered it. And suddenly it was very important to me. So when they deported me 3 days later, I went home and greeted my husband with great enthusiasm. And when I had a baby, I certainly didn't want to be going off on long open-ended assignments to places where you get thrown in the slammer anymore. So that was when I was really lucky, and I got the Kibble Award for my second book of non-fiction, Foreign Correspondence. And as you know, that's a prize specifically to encourage women writers. And I was very encouraged. And I thought, I'm going to use some of this prize money to take some time and see if I can write fiction.
So why fiction though? What was the appeal?
Because I didn't have to go off on a long open-ended assignment to get it. I could go on a very predictable 2-week research trip, taking my baby along and come home and then make up the rest.
Did you already have a set of stories that you'd encountered that you knew you wanted to tell?
No, because I didn't know if I could tell any of them. I mean, or that one, but that one had...
Was that one Year of Wonders?
Yeah, so Year of Wonders, you know, many years before, when I was still completely obsessed with being a foreign correspondent, I had a brief home leave. You know, I was living, based in London at the time, and I loved to go bushwalking or rambling, as they euphoniously call it, because there's no bush, of course, but from village to village and through, you know, what passes for a bit of wilderness. And we're in the Peak District, which is a very lovely and fairly unsung part of Britain, and saw this finger post that said Eam, the name of the village, and underneath in brackets, Plague Village. I go, that's interesting. Not many places try to get tourists to come by saying Plague Village. But it worked for me, and we went there, and in the church was this wonderful exhibit of what had happened in 1665 when bubonic plague was carried to the village in a bolt of infected cloth from London, and how the villagers took the unique decision to voluntarily quarantine themselves rather than flee and spread the infection, which is what happened every other single place. And that story just took hold of my imagination in some way, and even though I didn't run home and quit my job and run up to the garret and start writing, I did keep that story in my mind and thinking about the contemporary crises I was covering and wondering if anything that I was seeing in how people responded to catastrophes was like the people of Eam. So when I decided to see if I could write fiction, that was the story.
With your other fiction though, I mean, you've written about the real man, who you call March, the father from Little Women, who was sort of a utopian philosopher. You've written about a Native American scholar, a book conservator, now King David. What do you look for when you choose your subjects for your fiction?
I look for, so Mark Twain had this wonderful, he had so many wonderful lines, but one I particularly like, he said, fiction must be plausible, truth needn't be. And I look for implausible truths, these wonderful stories from the past. If I made up a village where they agreed to quarantine themselves, that's not as interesting as the fact that it was true. if I made up the fact that a Native American in the period of first contact, raised in his own language and culture, learned Latin and Greek and graduated from Harvard with the sons of the Puritan colonial elite, if I made that up, that wouldn't be so interesting. But because it's true, it's extremely interesting. But they're stories where you can't know everything. So I had started out to do a story about Jane Franklin because she's always intrigued me. She's probably the best traveled person, not just woman, of her era. She went all over the world. She was somebody who could see the brutalities of the convict system, particularly as they affected women, and the horror of the Aboriginal genocide much more clearly than other contemporaries of hers. And I was fascinated by her, and I loved that she, you know, basically walked across the Southwest wilderness, and she was not in a chair being carried. You know, people say, oh, she didn't walk across it, she was carried across it. They couldn't. If you've seen the horizontal scrub, nobody was carrying her. The chair was for propriety. So anyway, she was fascinating to me, but when I actually sat down with the material and started to form a novel, I found that she had written a journal which was meticulously kept and documented every single thing that happened to her. And I thought, holy cow, there's no room for imagination here. This is a job for a narrative historian. So I had to...
What about Alcott, though? Because I remember reading a long essay that you wrote in, I think, The New Yorker, about this historical figure who was fascinating, and it was a really terrific long-form article. You could have written the story of that man as straight history, but you chose to do it as fiction. So what did that offer you? What extra did you get?
I didn't set out to write about Bronson Alcott. Bronson Alcott was this gift wrap package that flew in the room after I started writing the novel that I wanted to write, which was to explore the idea of what happens to idealists who go to war because of their heartfelt conviction about a good cause, and then find themselves doing extremely bad things, as happened in every war. And I was very intrigued with that with the Civil War, because where we were living at the time was a village that had been settled by Quakers, and this is in Virginia. And then when the Civil War broke out, some of the young men thought that slavery was a greater evil than violence, and they enlisted to fight on the Union side. And this is from Virginia, so that was one thing. But they were Quakers, which was another, which meant they were going to be read out of their religious meeting. Of the better known writers of his time, Emerson and Thoreau, greatly. I mean, they would not have done what they did if it were not for Bronson. I truly believe that. And as one of the reviewers of that book put it, if Emerson and Thoreau are the shooting stars of American idealism, then Bronson Alcott was the dark matter from which they drew their energy. And so I didn't start out with Bronson, but Bronson was a gift to help me make a character for Mr. March.
And he was a writer. You also have the people of the book. Education is central in Year of Wonders and A Woman Learning, in Caleb's Crossing. And then in this book too, Nathan is a storyteller. Are you writing about the experience of reading and writing and why it matters? Is that central to it?
Well, it's certainly central to me. Books were everything in our family. You know, we didn't have a lot of material stuff when I was growing up, but my parents loved to read, and my sister and I would go to the local library, and we went on the bus because we didn't have a car, and Mum and Dad always brought home many books for the week, and we got library cards as soon as you could possibly scroll something that could be passed off as a signature. And it was just what we did in our family. And so when I think about people who have to do without that, and the struggle that so many people have had through, and yet they didn't teach their daughters to write. It was okay for a woman to learn to read because then she could read her Bible to the children, and that was a good thing. But why would you teach your daughter to write? Because writing is a skill that you use to communicate with people outside of the family. And what Puritan good wife needs to be doing that? So, you know, that there are no journals by women of that period is such a loss. Those voices are silent. The voices of enslaved people was silenced by law. It was against the law to teach a slave to read. So I'm drawn to sort of the agony of that predicament. And in Afghanistan, I heard about this girl who was banned from going to school under the Taliban, and she was so thirsty for knowledge that she would climb over the roofs of the houses and hide up on the roof and eavesdrop on the boys who were being educated at the madrasa. And that was how she stole her education.
Onwards Plus on RN, Radio Australia and online. You're with me, Kate Evans, listening again to a conversation I had late last year with novelist and former foreign correspondent Geraldine Brooks. Which are all based on all sorts of research. It seems that as you've gone on, you've had less and less solid evidence to work with. So in a way it's become harder and harder. And I'm wondering if that gives you more or less freedom as a writer.
Oh, look, it's a pain in the neck to not have any solid evidence. I like to have a good scaffolding of that. I'm not quite sure, I knew what I was getting into with David when I set out. I was fairly gobsmacked to find out that outside of the Bible we've got one stone inscription that even says he exists.
So why, that's the big question I guess, is why King David?
Oh, well, because what we do have in the Bible is a complete story of a man's life that encompasses everything that can happen to a human being. And it took a hold of me. I thought you can work on, every strong emotion, every fulfilled desire, every worst nightmare is available to you in his story. He's everything. He's an artist. He's a killer. He's a builder and forger of unity, and yet he's a very divisive figure. He loves his kids to a fault. He raises terrible kids, and then he raises one amazing one who's come down to us as the byword for wisdom. So what's not to like?
But how risky a choice is he, given that he's a figure of import in Judaism, in Christianity and in Islam? Was it a politically risky decision, do you think?
I wasn't thinking about that. I think I felt a lot more responsibility when I was writing about Caleb Chase Tearmuck, who was an actual Wampanoag from Martha's Vineyard, where I lived, who had an actual life that we know only the barest sketchy details, and I felt a great deal more burden than I did in taking on David, because there's this big Jewish tradition of you take the text that you've got, and if it's not satisfactory, then you make up stuff to fill in the holes. And this is an old tradition called Midrash, and people have been doing it for millennia. So this is just a bit of modern Midrash, basically.
So you're positioning yourself as a storyteller within the Jewish tradition? I guess that's what I was curious about, given that he's a figure who appears in so many traditions.
But yeah, well, no, I mean, I wanted... Okay, so what we have in the Hebrew Bible, and why I've chosen to use the names as they appear in the Hebrew Bible. Somebody said to me, why did you change the names? And I'm like, no, the real question is, why did King James change the names?
Can you just explain that, though? Because it has quite an impact as a reader that they are the Hebrew names rather than any sort of more familiar King James type names. So what are the names you used?
So Samuel is Shmuel, Nathan is Natan, Jonathan is Yonatan. The only really problematic one to me is Solomon is Shlomo, and that's really hard. In for a penny, in for a pound, right? But I wanted it to be unfamiliar. I didn't want people to think, I know these guys. These are the guys in the weird clothes and the funny facial hair in my colouring book from Sunday school. I didn't want that. And I also didn't want, because we've become very fond of giving our kids quite biblical names. I didn't want it to sound like, somebody calling out for their 4-year-old on the, Redfern playground, I wanted it to be as strange as it should be, given that it's the Second Iron Age. And so I reverted to the original names.
So what else did you need to know to imagine your way into the Second Iron Age?
Oh, lots of things. Everything from what they ate to what were the houses like. When they say it's a palace, what do they mean by that? How good could it be? What kind of weapons were available to them? What were their battle tactics? What did Hebrew music sound like? What kind of instrument was considered a harp in those days? Everything. So, and instead of being able to rely on letters and journals and the usual things that I would use, I relied a lot on archaeological research, and so it's the difference between what's written down and what's thrown in the garbage, basically.
And so you present this figure who's charismatic and beautiful and a singer and unbearably cruel. How important is the violence to telling the story?
The story is a very violent story, and excruciatingly so in some passages. It's violent in the scriptural text, and you can't really write about it and avert your eyes from that. And so, I drew on my experience as a war correspondent in that region. Some really difficult things that I saw, and yes, the weaponry is different. Modern weaponry is very different, but the effect on the body is not different.
How much were you drawing on your experience as a political and foreign correspondent in describing the backstabbing and terrible levels of betrayal?
Yeah, well, this is, power and its temptations, and what people are prepared to do and what they're prepared to give up, and how much of themselves they will give up, and how power changes people. This is a timeless story. The party room in Canberra is not so different from a Second Iron Age palace in Israel, apparently. I tell the story that as I was researching this, I was so intrigued that General David Petraeus, who was the U.S. military commander in northern Iraq, his soldiers' nickname for him was King David. And then, of course, he scandalously committed adultery with his biographer. Biographers are very dangerous people, apparently. Remembering Bob Hawke. I heard that Gough Whitlam, when a beautiful woman would walk into the room, he would say, "She's very lovely. I wish she would be my biographer."
But the other timeless aspect of the story is what happens to the women in your novel. So a lot of the violence is directed at them. They're used as political pawns. They're often hidden and silenced. Why was that so important to you? Does that go back to the 9 parts of design?
Totally. There's a complete through line there. And I think that what attracted me to this story was that is one place in the Bible where there are very well drawn female characters, because usually we don't get much about the women. Lot's wife. Mrs. Lot. We don't even know her name. Give me a break. Noah's wife is, pretty important. All that animal husbandry. And yet, no name again, whereas David's wives are sketched quite brilliantly, but with great economy, and also only from a male point of view, and only insofar as how they were important to David, but how he affected their lives and what happened to them outside this narrow focus is not stated, but I was fascinated by it. So I wanted to go in and switch the point of view and see him through their eyes.
But we're also seeing him through the eyes of his biographer, who's the narrator. What can you tell us about your Nathan?
So Nathan, I always need a voice. I like to write in first person because I think it gives an emotional connection and a directness, and it does so much of the work for you if you get the right voice, because how they talk tells you who they are, and that character tell you how they're likely to act, and that sets you plot in motion for you. So until I've got a voice, I really haven't got anything, and I wasn't sure who was going to be the voice of this novel until I came across in the Book of Chronicles a couple of references to the Book of Nathan, which it states tells the story of David, his acts from first to last. So I looked up Nathan. We don't have a Book of Nathan, but Nathan is a character in the books of Samuel, and a very important one whose role is to castigate the king for his moral failures and to tell him the terrible consequences that will come to him from these things. And I thought, this is a really cool guy. Who has the guts to do this? And how do you get to be that guy? And if we had this book that apparently existed and now exists no more, what more would we know about David? And how would a truth teller like this have gone about constructing the account of the acts from first to last? And so that set the novel in motion for me.
So you've got David, the shining singer, the architect of a new city, in some ways of a whole imagined state there. Is he the hero of your novel, or is it somebody else?
I think maybe Shlomo is the hero, or at least he's the figure that redeems everything, because he's the one who will take what David has built on these corrupt foundations of so much bloodshed, and he will give a time of peace, because the novel doesn't go there, but when Solomon consolidates his power after that, he becomes renowned for the peacefulness. You know, that's the one time where every man can rest under his own grape arbor and olive tree. Very remarkable thing for that part of the world where people still can't do that even today.
And so Shlomo, or Solomon, as the moral force, he's only there at the very end of the book. Will he get his own novel?
We'll see. My youngest son wants me to write this because this one is dedicated to my older son, because he was the harpist who got me thinking about other boy harpists. But my youngest son is from Ethiopia, and in Ethiopia there is a complete conviction that the first king of Ethiopia was Solomon's son by the Queen of Sheba.
Well, I want to read that book. And this is a good opportunity now to hear from you and any questions you might have for Geraldine.
Good evening. I'm interested in how much research you have to do for these books, because they seem to be so alive and real and taking such unusual subjects and areas. But what length of time or how many people do you have to help you? How does it go?
Me, myself, and I. You can't delegate. Oh, well, that's not true. I took my 10-year-old as a research assistant when we went to Israel to go and be in the places that are associated with David. But no, I don't have researchers, because they wouldn't necessarily notice the thing that might be the very thing that will give me the idea how to connect this piece with your imagination as a reader. I don't do it first. I just do enough to get that voice sorted out, to figure out who that person is and how they sound. And then I start writing. And I let the story tell me what I need to know. And then I go and find it out. And I write again until I get to another blank space where I need to know something. And I do it that way because I think that there's a real risk, particularly in historical fiction, but in anything that's deeply researched, that you'll fall in love with a particular set of information just because it's interesting in itself or because it was really hard to get it. And you'll cram it in there, whether the story needs it or not. And there was a really good book that I was enjoying enormously. And then, you know, obviously the novelist had gone to a lot of trouble researching how you tune a piano, because there comes a point about a third of the way through the book, he's tuning a piano, and this character says to him, "How do you tune a piano?" Anyway, and then the next 10 pages are all about how you tune a piano. And I thought, oh, you know, so I try and take all the piano tuning out of my novels.
Thank you. Thank you for your fantastic books. I was wondering, in light of the comments about the role of women, whether, as I've been enjoying introducing 9 Parts of Desire to women who are interested in learning more about why women respect their cultures and do what they do within their own cultures, whether you'd update that book in some way. What were the things that you would do in 2015? You could add to 9 Parts of Desire from when you wrote it to me.
Yeah,
please.
so I did do an afterword to the book after 9/11, because everybody kept saying, well, what do you think now? And so eventually I sat down and I wrote that, and in that afterword I also wrote, as far as I knew, what had happened to the women in the book. I can't really update that book without doing what I did then, which was live among the women of that region for 6 years, and that's not possible now. But what I would do if I was that person is probably, you know, much more dangerous than what I did, but I really would want to know what it is like to be a woman in territory controlled by ISIS. You know, that is a story that very much needs to be told.
And there might well be a young journalist in the room who's prepared to do that.
Well, yeah, just if they are, be safe.
And at microphone 2, we have another question.
Hi, Geraldine. My name's Julia. Thank you. I have quite a simple question. When do you know that your writing is good? A simple question. Well done.
Yeah, you never know, and it's never good enough. I mean, this book was really ridiculous because I was still revising it as it was, you know, they really were saying, you have to give it back now. And every page I would look down and there would be something else that needed to be changed, and since I got the finished book, I've changed 2 things for the next edition already, and I'm sure I'll find more. You know, it's never right. Except you have to surrender at some point. But I also, you know, I'm a bit selfish in that I write what I like to read myself. So if it's starting to, you know, sound like the kind of book I like to read, then I know I'm on the right track.
Prize winner for literature, Svetlana Alexievich, and her works and the storm that it's creating, whether it's deserving, not deserving, literature, politics.
I think that it's remarkable that the prize went to a journalist, and I think that it is an acknowledgement that journalism can be literary and can play an extremely important role in the cultural conversation, that it doesn't have to be
Bahraini refugee Hakeem El Arabi has been
that writing about the present and taking the trouble to absolutely find out what is going on and take a stand. I think it's wonderful that a light was shone on this important work. And always controversy, that's fantastic. I mean, controversy is, I love it when people are arguing about books. What would be better?
Thank you. Hi. I was wondering whether your book, which I find quite scholarly, whether you wanted us to work a little bit harder by seeking out the meanings of the quotations in Hebrew. And I personally was resorting to Google to find out the meanings of the words. And that really, I felt that I had to work hard to get to know them. And one particular word, description of a place which I really enjoyed was Har Megiddo, which of course is Armageddon, and not explaining that, you know, it was the hill of Megiddo, but I had to do the work to find that out myself. I felt that was kind of you throwing out a challenge that you have to do a bit of work to get the most out of this book.
Yeah, no, I wasn't really trying to torture you. I just think that it's more evocative if you give the place names as they appeared in the Hebrew Bible. And if there is a frisson of recognition like that, then that to me is more like an added bonus. Like, you don't have to know that Bethlehem is Bethlehem, but if you do make that connection, then I think that's kind of, you know, that's a cool moment for the reader. Or that was, I was trying to, you know, give little presents, not homework. I have mixed feelings listening to your question. The last thing you want to do as a novelist is take someone out of the story. And to the extent that this is a distraction to you as a reader.
Well, I'm interested in language, so it was no burden for me, but I imagined that it would have possibly crowded the room.
I tried to, if I was using a Hebrew expression, I tried to back into it so that some of those words, and I thought that it was much that was surprising that I maybe didn't put in. I'm sure there were things, but I really can't come up with anything. I think if I found out anything that surprised me, I tried to shoehorn it in there.
Hello. Look, I love your books because they combine both fact and the lyricism of your writing, which is just fabulous. But I really am interested in, having read them all, which is your favourite character, or if not, which one should we not like?
Yeah, that's a very good question. People often ask which is your favourite book, and I really can't do that because the books are so bound up with the memories of the time, the writing of them, the research, the fun I had with my kids, who I always exploit as research assistants because they see the world in such a fresh way. But people haven't asked me who's my favourite character, and I think it's probably Anna Frith, who was the first person who rose up out of the grave and started talking to me, so I'm very grateful to her. And I liked her company very much. I loved the way she changed, how she stepped up out of her very circumscribed life and fought her fears and did what she needed to do for her neighbours. And so when I finished that book, I found I missed her a lot, and I would find myself still talking to her in my head, which is a little disturbing.
On ABC RN and at the Sydney Writers' Festival, we've been talking tonight to Geraldine Brooks. Please do thank her. Geraldine Brooks' The Secret Chord is published by Hachette. You can find details of her other books by following the links to the Books Plus page at abc.net.au/rn. And do join...
He successfully got support from the Senate crossbench and Labor for that bill, and the listeners might remember that the government was so freaked out about this they went through all sorts of permutations to stop those amendments being voted on when they were returned to the House in the last couple of days of sittings of the Parliament last year.
So explain it to me in simple terms. Has Labor been wedged on this, or is Labor doing the wedging?
Look, I think there's been some wedging and counter-wedging going on here, Philip, but the way it's been working is Labor supported this legislation in the Senate, and it was all looking pretty good, and if it had got through the House of Representatives or had been put up for a vote in December, I'm pretty sure Labor would have supported it then. Now, despite all its problems, votes are one of those issues that freaked Labor out, and the government has been playing to that big time in the last couple of weeks. There were signs that Cathy McGowan in the House of Representatives might waver into support for these amendments, which were generally being supported by the majority of the crossbench in the House. When she looked like she was going to waver and therefore the bill would fall, whatever Labor did, Labor started to sort of say, well, we need a few changes here, or maybe we're looking for a compromise and all these things. The government sniffed an opportunity and has been going absolutely hammer and tongs at Labor for the last week or so, particularly in the last few days, and has been saying, well, Labor's showing its true colours, it's soft on border protection, blah-de-blah-de-blah. So there were all classic signs that Labor would be wedged. Now what's happened now is that Labor has accepted or has asked for a security assessment to test all of these arguments that the government has made that the bill would sort of allow would lead to the collapse of the border protection system, that it would let criminals of all sorts of descriptions into the system.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that raises the issue of the leak of ASIO briefings.
Oh, look, there are leaks and leaks, Philip. It's apparently okay to leak ADO briefings now if they fit into the government narrative, but not the rest of the time. So there was a very helpful leak which suggested that the security agencies were very concerned about this legislation at the beginning of last week, elected Australians, and there was this bizarre sort of scenario where the head of the Home Affairs Department announced that there would be a police investigation into this leak, that the documents that were leaked have now been declassified so that we can all look at them, and they weren't quite as hysterical as has been suggested in Australia, which is a major surprise. But anyway, so there's been all sorts of machinery of government has been put into place to maximise the apparent threat that this legislation poses to the general public. Mr. and Mrs. Stringbag, you and I.
Hiding behind harassment struck Laura Tingle. Laura, something else which was recently leaked was the Banking Royal Commission, and it sprung a few leaks. Tell me how it's playing out.
Look, I think this is one of the interesting things, Philip. I mean, we've all been obviously pretty concerned and interested in what's happening with this asylum seeker legislation because it has real-world implications for 1,000 people still stuck on Manus and Nauru. The Royal Commission it's sort of been interesting, really, because people started to focus on it a bit, and there's been a lot more notice paid to the fact that the main people who were knocked about by name in the Royal Commission were the two senior people at the National Australia Bank, Mr. Thorburn and Dr. Henry, but there's been a lot of dissatisfaction from people who had gripes with the banks that the Royal Commission didn't name names in terms of criminal prosecutions and didn't directly refer anybody to the Director of Public Prosecutions. But at a political level, I think the interesting thing is that Labor has obviously got a political interest in pursuing this issue and has suggested that Parliament sit for a bit longer than the current 7 days between now and the election so that it can discuss actually implementing some of the reforms the Commission has recommended. Now, this all sounded a bit like it was just a bit of a stunt, but it sounds to me a bit like the crossbenchers will actually support this push by Labor. So it is possible at this point that the Parliament may actually be recalled for a few days to at least discuss and possibly implement some of the reforms suggested by the Royal Commission.
Not so long ago, you were telling me that Labor had an idea about getting the Royal Commission up and running again.
Well, that's right. I think that time has probably passed, but I think there's still a possibility that it remains a political issue and that the government really has to think twice about how, whether it's left with this sort of impression that it doesn't want to act on the recommendations of the Royal Commission, and that may mean that it's being brought back to Parliament when it really doesn't want to be anywhere near the Parliament, because that means all its own members get to talk to each other, and that's never a very good look, is it, Philip?
No, it isn't. Now, as we head towards the April budget and the subsequent possible May election, what are the polls saying about the leaders?
Look, the polls are saying, I don't think the polls have changed all that much. Like, the numbers might change from week to week. Scott Morrison leads Bill Shorten as preferred Prime Minister, but not by anywhere near the sorts of margins we've seen in the past. And I think if you talk to the qualitative pollsters, that is people who talk to the notorious focus groups as opposed to the people who just count the numbers in percentage terms on votes, they're saying that the disillusion with the government is still incredibly intense. People don't feel that their own issues are being addressed, and that the things that people are concerned about are the ones that affect them. Now, the important thing I think about this asylum seeker issue is whether this is the one thing that sort of shakes that loose and makes people think differently about the political prospects. But I talked to a few people at the end of last week whose judgment I respect on the sort of qualitative polling, and they're just saying, look, people want governments to do stuff for them. They want them to address the fact that their wages haven't gone up. They want them to make the trains run on time, dare I say. They want to be able to get to work on time, and these are the sorts of issues that they feel intense dissatisfaction about, and they are not at all impressed that Scott Morrison necessarily will do a better job at delivering that than Bill Shorten.
Thank you for that, Laura. And that was Laura Tingle, who is, of course, 730's chief political. I'm making the point that I think they're love letters between John and the Palace, but you probably dispute that. And
Well, I would, largely because I've seen extracts from some of the letters. I mean, there's a great deal of material that's come out in recent years, largely through, my quite unhealthy obsession with Trump Kerr's archives, most of which are, of course, open in the archives. These letters are not, but also through other archives, Alfred Fraser's and Reg Withers having been particularly important in unravelling the story of the dismissal. But there were among her papers extracts, only very short extracts from about 7 of these Palace letters, and in the course of this court case, that's been acknowledged that they are extracts from Palace letters, and they're very bland, pedestrian descriptions of events, of political happenings, of discussions in particular with Gough Whitlam. What is interesting is that, and this is only 7 of what we think to be the 40 or 50 letters among this grouping called Palace letters, but it's interesting that he mentions the word dismissal, and obviously the fear of either his dismissal or Whitlam's dismissal is uppermost in those letters that he's sending to the Palace at the time. So there's a couple of things that we know and areas for concern in what we already know that Kerr was discussing with the Palace.
the reason I suggested there's something else going on is because he wrote so frequently. There's sometimes 5 letters a day.
It is an extraordinary amount of material, and yes, others have commented also that, this is quite a bizarre situation, but I think it does fit part of a pattern that we now know, we didn't of course know for many years, but we now see in Kerr's behaviour, which is that he cultivated almost, I think, the key individuals and the key institutions that he would need to have, if not behind him, at least aware of the direction he was going in. And I include in that what we now know was his prior contact with Malcolm Fraser. We know that, as I revealed in the dismissal dossier only a couple of years ago, from Reg Withers' papers, a posthumous interview which only became available a couple of years ago, in which he recounts being in Fraser's office when Kerr made a secret private telephone call prior to the dismissal. Now this has been denied for decades, but that, together with, of course, the revelations about Sir Anthony Mason's involvement, all of this has been kept from the Australian people for decades. But what Kerr is doing there is ensuring that key individuals from key institutions that might otherwise have not accepted the path he was taking were all at the very least aware of it and not going to speak out against it. And I think that makes sense when you think back to the unprecedented nature of what Kerr did. He could not have gone down that path and replaced an elected government that retained its majority in the House of Representatives at all times, that is the Whitlam government, with the leader of the opposition that not only did not have the confidence of the House, but which the House voted a motion of no confidence in that afternoon. If he did not know that Malcolm Fraser would accept that commission and be prepared to stay in office despite losing a motion of confidence.
You mentioned that the word dismissal occurs, but it may be Kerr worrying about his own. This is outside the terms of reference of the letters, but why the hell didn't Gough move to dismiss Kerr?
Look, it's not something that Whitlam would have done, in the sense that he had an extraordinary, and still maintained even after the dismissal, an extremely strong commitment to the different roles and functions of the different arms of government.
In other words, he took them very, very seriously.
Oh, absolutely, and you can see that, I think, in his response to the dismissal, which was not as if, like Margaret Whitlam advised him to immediately tear it up and tell Kerr to get over himself. It was to accept that letter and to go off and fight the election on that campaign, even though he thought it was grossly improper not to act on the advice of the Prime Minister, as Kerr had refused to. Well, you have to remember also that Whitlam had gone into Yarralumla that afternoon believing, and Kerr had led him to believe, that they were to call the half-Senate election. And I think this is often forgotten in the history. This is why Whitlam always called it an ambush. Now, Kerr refused to accept that advice when they had discussed the advice over the previous 4 days. They'd discussed the wording of the announcement just that morning, and instead, as Whitlam moved to hand Kerr the letter, the formal advice for the half-Senate election, Kerr refused to take it and said, I have instead a letter of my own for you, which was, of course, the famous dismissal letter. So all of those things, Whitlam never had an opportunity to remove Kerr, and he was unaware that Kerr was actively deceiving him at that point.
Is it the case that all correspondence between Queen and GG are deemed personal?
Certainly in this case, yes. The letters that are in this bundle date the end point and the start point are over the entirety of Kerr's tenure as Governor General. So certainly the ones that we're seeking, that's the case, and that is the case in the archives for the royal correspondence, and has been for some time. But of course, in the intervening time, we've had the passage of our own legislation, that is the Archives Act, and one of our, of course, very strong views is that the Archives Act does not make this very clear distinction between the Governor-General's records. It was certainly something that was considered in the earlier drafts, but it's not explicit. It's more of a confused, if you like, partial distinction in the Act to remove the Governor-General's records, and that formed a very strong part of our case, that it's not clear that these records ought to be excluded, and unfortunately we were not successful in having that argument before the court.
This is Alan Allen. I'm talking to Professor, indeed Emeritus Professor Jenny Hocking. Now, with this decision, the monarch's embargo over release will continue till at least 2027, potentially indefinitely.
Yeah, these terms were put, it's very interesting to look at the terms of deposit actually, because personal records can contain their own terms of access, unlike Commonwealth records that go into the archives and then have to be released after the public access term, which has been 30 years, is now reducing to 20. But unlike that, these come with their own terms. The terms that were put on it, or as they currently stand, they're actually changed in the 1990s, which is interesting in itself. They were changed after Kerr's death, but as it stands, they're not for release until 2027. But even after that date, they require the approval of both our Governor-General's Official Secretary and the Queen's Private Secretary. So what remains is an effective final veto for the Queen's Private Secretary. If the Queen's Private Secretary, that is the Queen or the monarch, does not agree, those letters will not be released. It's as simple as that. So there is a potential indefinite embargo over them.
Jenny, any chance that other pieces of the puzzle will emerge? Might there be other documents waiting to be found?
Well, given what we've already found, which has been, truly startling, and I point particularly to the revelations of Sir Anthony Mason's long involvement with Kerr prior to the dismissal, which was hidden for 37 years, which Mason himself acknowledged once that came out in my biography. But other than that, I think it would have remained hidden. So having found, as we now know, such a vastly different history of the dismissal from the one we'd understood even 10 years ago, then yes, I would say nothing is impossible, because it's the story that keeps giving, and I think it does that. I think the history of the dismissal continues to unfold largely because of this extraordinary level of secrecy around what happened. And it's one of the really startling things as a historian to look at that material, to go back to first basics and find material in the archives, and to be truly shocked at the extent to which some of the key participants actively discussed hiding that material, and I'm speaking here of Sir Garfield Barwick and Sir John Kerr. There's a set of letters about 7 years after the dismissal, in fact it's on the anniversary of the dismissal, where they actually discuss at what point they should alert the Australian public to the role that they're aware of Sir Anthony Mason. And as if our history is their personal plaything, that they will determine at what point the Australian people can know that side of the story of the dismissal. Now, I found that extraordinary, that people at that level of public governance, public institutions, could be discussing such a momentous event in our history, and when we might be able to know some of the key figures involved. Quite remarkable.
I can only agree wholeheartedly. Thank you, Jenny Hocking. The good professor is Emeritus Professor at Monash and, of course, Gough Whitlam's biographer. And I am delighted to say that after a little bit of music, we were welcomed back to the program after too long an absence, in Saikal, to discuss the 40th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution.
This is World News Tonight. Good evening. Now we know the United States